interesting one. It's going to be very, very, you know, interesting and, inspiring and all that. So you can introduce yourself in the chat box as usual, where you're coming from, and like, yeah, what you do. So before we start, I would want us to, engage ourselves in a little activity on Menti. So please go to menti.com. I'm going to share our question for the day, and you can get interactive on the page. So allow me to share my Menti screen. Then we move on. Thank you. Can you still see my screen?
No, not
All
anymore.
right. Yeah, I think I have some technical problems, but we are still going to move on. So for today, I would want us to share our expectations for the day in one word. So what do you intend to achieve at the end of this presentation, the end of this training? So kindly go to the chat box and make your input. Having problems with this. I think someone. Great. Yeah, please go to the chat box and I'll be sharing my Menti screen soon. All right. Really sorry about that. I think I have yeah. So yeah, kindly input your kindly make your inputs in the chat box, and I would ask Karishma to read them out as we wait for the next item on the agenda. Karishma, can you hear me? Or
Yes,
Mohammed?
I'm just waiting for more people to type, but
All right.
one word, many say that it's hard to say about one word on this session. So they're
Okay.
looking forward towards it being insightful, knowledge, and also more importantly, to improve the technical knowledge related to climate financing. This is like a basic gap that we have noticed as well when we work with young people in terms of capacity building and the technical knowledge that they need, the perspective. Danish said about data. Sorry, Danish highlighted the data gaps that we might have as well. So to know more about data, where it comes from, especially data from the most vulnerable countries, to be able to mobilize the climate finance for that. In session 4, you would have more information about the data collection. Also in session 3, how to quantify these climate finance, and also what are the different work programs under UNFCCC that is being rolled out or ongoing, so that they can talk about the data gaps that is out there. Then it's also about understanding, providing an approach to that. And Cirilo said that by the end of the session, he would like to know the landscape of climate finance initiatives and what are the types of negotiation skills related to climate finance. Cirilo, landscape of climate finance initiative is going to come by next week, where we have two speakers from climate policy initiatives and NDC partnerships coming in just to talk about this landscaping. And in session 4, we are going to have a representative from UNFCCC Secretariat that handles climate finance matters to talk about more on negotiation skills and their work programs. So, and also Regina said she would like to have takeaway knowledge to apply to the work in climate finance. So I could see that the interest is there. You have highlighted some gaps, be it data, tools, methodology, understanding, and also capacity building that we need to have in terms of youth. So that's basically it. I would hand over to Mariam.
Thank you so much, Karishma. Thank you. And there were interesting inputs. So next item on the agenda, I would be introducing our speaker for today. And I hope you can hear me, please.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So our speaker for today is in the person of Tiffany Grafsky, who is the SSE Academy Head, United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange. That's the SSE, right? So she is she's been the head and as she has been the head at the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, who engages with who makes engagements in stock exchange to disseminate consistent and pragmatic education on pressing global topics affecting capital markets participants. The UNSSE initiative is a United Nations partnership program organized by UNCTAD, the UN Global Compact, UN EPFI, and the UNPRI, forgive me. It's a mission to provide a global platform for exploring how exchanges in collaborations with investors, companies, regulators, policymakers, and relevant international organizations can enhance performance on ESG principles, as the environmental, social, and corporate governance issues, and encourage sustainable investment, including the financing of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The UNSSE seeks to achieve the mission through an integrated program of conducting evidence-based policy analysis, facilitating a network and forum for multi-stakeholder consensus building, and providing technical assistance and advisory services. Tiffany has a PhD in management, and her thesis evaluated in mechanisms of change with organizations through partnerships and ecosystems that contribute to solving the world's most pressing global challenges. As part of her PhD journey, Tiffany spent time as a visiting researcher at the University of Alberta Business School and the Cambridge Judge Business School. She also has an MBA specialized in international organizations from the University of Geneva. Ooh. Prior to her current role, Tiffany also served as a deputy coordinator for the UN SSE initiative, and prior to this work, as a journalist in Latin America. So kindly help me welcome Tiffany as she takes us through her presentation today to build our capacity and sharpen our skills when it comes to analyzing climate finance and data and reporting on it. Thank you very much, Tiffany, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for that great introduction. And I'm very pleased to be with all of you here today. This is a very interesting group of people and a very interesting initiative. So thank you so much for including me in this today. As I've just had a great introduction, I'm not going to tell you much about myself, but I will tell you what I was here to talk to you about today. And what I hope that we can cover today, with the caveat that if there's something else you want to talk about, or if there's some other way that I can help you in this learning journey, we're in a live session today, which is always much more fun than recording and sending it out to everyone. So please, at any point, if you have any questions or something that you want to share, don't hesitate to ask me about that. So just getting started with our objectives here today. So first and foremost, I was asked to cover, of course, climate-related financial data and three core areas of it. I was asked to look at where we can find climate-related financial data. I was asked to look at what is climate-related financial data and how can you interpret this. So that is my goal today, and hopefully you come out of that with those three things. A lot of the things you're looking for today, such as insight, knowledge, capacity, data, tools, I think we'll touch on a lot of that. I hope that what you really come out of this with is really understanding the foundation of what this data is for and why it's helpful for any of the roles that you're all doing, whether you continue a career that's linked to the UN and in climate negotiations, whether you go into the private sector and start to work in investing in companies, or maybe you work for a company yourself and you need to start looking at how you disclose this information. I hope that this will be useful for any of those pathways. So let's start off with where. So where can you find climate-related financial data? Now, this used to be a very difficult question, but the good thing is increasingly we're getting more and more and more data. But I think to get started, I think that where question is really why I'm here today. This logo behind me, the SSE, most of you probably haven't seen it before. It's something that confuses a lot of people. What do stock exchanges have to do with sustainability? We normally think capital markets, and we think greed and money, and perhaps things that we're not used to associating with sustainability. Yeah, I saw someone said Jamaica has joined the SSE. Indeed, yes, Jamaica is. A lot of your countries, actually, many of you who are here, your stock exchange in your country is a member of the SSE. And increasingly, really all stock exchanges are really interested in sustainability because finance and sustainability have been so interlinked now. So as you can see on this slide, there are more than 130 members of the SSE initiative. Now this includes both, bog standard mainstream stock exchanges, such as the Jamaica Stock Exchange. We also have, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, which you can see here on the screen, Deutsche Börse, the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Pretty much any country that you're coming from, you probably have a stock exchange that's a member. Keeping in mind that most countries have kind of one main stock exchange. Some have two or three, which is dependent on the country's makeup. But then we also have smaller exchanges, and sometimes we have regional exchanges that pull together multiple exchanges, such as in Africa, we have the BRVM, which kind of pulls together a number of African exchanges. So with those exchanges, we then work through a partnership program. And as you can see on the screen, and as we heard in the introduction, it's really a coordination between 3 UN agencies and an NGO. So I'm based at UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. We partner with the UN Global Compact, which you might know is kind of the UN agency for the private sector. We also work with UNEP Finance Initiative. So those of you who were here last week, you probably heard from David, who's coming from UNEP FI. And then we also work with PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment. Together, we work with the whole ecosystem of capital markets. So that's not just the stock exchange. That's, of course, also the investors. It's the companies that are listed on a stock exchange. It's also all the companies in the value chain who supply or provide services to companies that are listed on stock exchanges. And of course, those who are investing in those companies. So why do we work with stock exchanges? We get this question a lot. So just wanted to highlight it straight from the get-go. It's really about their leverage point in the marketplace. So if you think about it, a stock exchange is actually usually quite a small organization. We're talking about the Rwanda Stock Exchange I went to a few years ago, and they have only a few employees, and their trading is still on a whiteboard, and it's more about teaching people how to invest in capital markets. But the Rwanda Stock Exchange actually is doing a huge amount of work in the country to introduce sustainability to those companies. And specifically because a lot of the companies that are listing on the Rwanda Stock Exchange look to have access to international finance and to provide certain services or certain products to international supply chains. So really why we work with stock exchanges is because they're that leverage point between investors, policymakers, and civil society, and all the companies that are listed. So there's over 60,000 companies, and listed companies, as you know, are very large companies that have a fairly big impact. So that's why we started working with stock exchanges. And what exactly do stock exchanges do when it comes to sustainability? You will receive the slide deck, and I recommend opening up this publication here. It's the newest World Investment Report. This is an annual report we put out at UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And you can see here our trend line of all the stock exchanges that we've tracked their sustainability activities since the year 2000. And as you can see, the number of sustainability activities they've been doing has increased significantly. Actually, how it started in the early days was we used to start to see regulatory requirements, and that can be either from the stock exchange themselves, or it can be from the regulatory authority in the country that sets those requirements. And what we mean by requirements, and we'll talk more about those later, is it's saying that if you want to be listed on a stock exchange, if you want to access finance in that way, you have to disclose certain information. Now, if any of you are familiar with the IPO process or how it goes to list on a stock exchange, you'll know there's already many requirements. This is why some companies decide not to IPO, because it's sometimes quite a slow and arduous and expensive process to be able to list on a stock exchange, which is why we only have, the biggest companies that are listing on stock exchanges. But it started with some stock exchanges and some jurisdictions saying, well, if we're going to require, for example, quarterly reporting and financial accounting in alignment with certain accounting standards, why don't we also require certain ESG, environmental or social governance requirements as well? And then we started to see, as you can see, that's the lowest line. It's the one that's slowed, or that's increased the least. But we are increasing that with every year. And I think after the ISSB standards, which we'll discuss later, now we'll see more and more of that regulation coming out. Some other ways stock exchanges are supporting sustainability is through products. So the next two highest there, we see ESG bond segments, and we also see markets covered by an ESG index. And just to note that these are both different products. So bond products are debt products. So it's similar, you might know of like a government bond that you may have invested in. It's basically a loan given to a company or a government. And we can have those loans that are earmarked, or they're specifically for certain sustainability aligned projects. So for example, you might have seen that Apple had a green bond, and that was to put solar panels on all of their buildings to use more clean energy. Stock exchanges can make it easier for investors to find those bonds by labeling them a certain way, or having a segment where you can find bonds specifically for sustainability related projects. Also, you might be able to find an ESG index. And for those who aren't super familiar with the finance world, an index is simply a basket of different equities or shares of companies. So you can't actually buy an index, but you can buy a portion of a fund that's made based on that index. So the index is really the first step to being able to group together sustainability aligned projects and be able to invest in those projects. And then we see, as we move up that line, sustainability reports. So these are stock exchanges that are increasing their own reporting on sustainability. They're sharing with their market what they're doing on their sustainability front. And then we move back up and we see two orange ones there. There's written guidance on ESG disclosure and training on ESG topics. So these are the two we're really going to focus on today. And I see someone asked, what is the total number of exchanges that you track? So we track all of our partner exchanges as well as all those covered by the World Federation of Exchanges. So that's about 125 stock exchanges that we're tracking. So that'll give you a sense of how many are working on this. And just to note, the reason that we have that super big uptick on training is because in 2021, we launched the SSE Academy, where we support stock exchanges and training, and we provide them the expertise and the logistics. So we made training a lot easier for them. So a number of stock exchanges are doing training on this topic that they wouldn't have done before. So those top two in orange are both related to disclosure. It's both related to information that companies have to provide to the markets, such as climate-related financial information. So why are they providing training on this? And why are they providing guidance on this? Well, it's a bit because, as you can see on the screen, super confusing. So a lot of companies are really lost in a bit of an alphabet soup. There's all these acronyms, all these initiatives. They're not really sure what to do with all of them. There's constant shifting and changing in not only the regulatory requirements, but also what's considered kind of best practice or the global standard for sustainability reporting. But luckily, in recent years, really just very recent years, we're seeing a convergence of standards and really a simplification, which means it's easier for companies, but it's also easier for those using the data to understand the data because we're comparing apples with apples rather than apples with oranges. So let's just take a moment here and look at what's been happening lately. Let's dig into this very confusing slide right here. So if we look at the very bottom, we have a few different logos here. We have the Integrated Reporting, or IR. We have SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. We also have at the bottom there, you can see CDP, which started out as the Carbon Disclosure Project, but then they went beyond carbon, so they just shortened simply to CDP. And at the same time, of course, we always had GRI, which you can see on the right, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. And these were more or less our main frameworks for understanding how to disclose any information that's not considered part of our financial accounting. So you can see there we have FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, and the IFRS accounting, which are the two main global standards for providing information related to the financial well-being of each company. So all accountants will be familiar with those, and all stock exchanges will require you to use one of those standards to report financial information. However, we found in the sustainability realm, some companies were using integrated reporting, or IR. Others, specifically in the US, were using SASB, and others were using CDP, and also using the CDSB guidelines. And then we also got introduced to TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And you might have already also heard of TNFD, which is looking at nature or biodiversity. So we had all these different acronyms happening here. And actually what we've been doing is grouping them together, pulling them together with what kind of connects together, and preventing duplication of processes. So IR and SASB got consolidated into the Value Reporting Foundation. And then that got consolidated together with CDSB and TCFD to create the IFRS Sustainability Standards, also known as the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. So the good thing is we basically have that top bubble there. We have financial accounting, we have sustainability related financial accounting, and we have GRI standards. Now, how do these differ? That can still be a little bit confusing. The main differentiation here is about materiality. So if you're not familiar with the term materiality, I just want to lightly touch it here. There's various ways to talk about this. Sometimes we hear single materiality or double materiality. Sometimes we're also hearing triple materiality now. We also hear inside out, outside in. We can term this various ways, but really the main way to think about this is where is the impact that we're looking at. So we can look at it from an outside in perspective, which means we have the planet that's going through some changes, climate change is happening. Regardless of what's causing those changes, there's going to be an impact on our organizations. So if we have increased flooding, if we have severe weather, if we have shifts in regulation to combat that, there's going to be a financial impact on our organization that we have to be accounting for. And we also have to invest in certain areas in our companies to be able to prepare for those changes. So that is a cost. So we need to be able to put that into our financial statements in some way. So that's the outside in perspective, often also referred to as single materiality. But then we can look at it the other way as well, meaning as our company changes its behavior or not, it will also have an impact on the environment. So how we treat our supply chain, how we treat our employees, how we treat the environment around us will also have an impact on the environment, which then of course continues the cycle back on our organization. So these are two separate perspectives, the outside in or the inside out, which are taken into consideration when we decide where to disclose certain information and how to disclose that information. But it's really important for all of you to just understand that they're not separate, really. They're very much interconnected. Of course, as we continue to damage the planet, those damaging effects of the planet will continue to impact the way our businesses run and how we finance those businesses and how well those businesses survive in that new climate. So it's really a cycle that constantly is connected, but it impacts how we disclose information based on where that impact is on an organization or on the planet. So this is just another way of looking at it. This is what the ISSB or the IFRS Foundation use the term called a building blocks approach. So you can see there's 3 blocks here. The outside ones are the easiest ones to understand. So the gray one we see is financial accounting. So this is what, all accountants are very familiar with. We've had the same accounting principles for some time now. So it's all our financial statements that we're used to providing information on if we're a listed company and even beyond that. So at any board meeting, you'll share this financial information. This is how a company looks at how well they're doing and how resilient they will be moving forward based on how much debt they have, how much money they have in the bank, how prepared they are for different shocks, how much they're expecting to increase their income, etc. And then if we look at the last box, the largest one, that's sustainability reporting, which really goes much beyond that. And it's really looking at that impact on the environment. It's quite simple in terms of we just want to understand what is our organization's impact on everything around us. That includes our employees, that includes value chain, our supply chain, that includes the environment, the climate, nature, biodiversity, etc. So we want to understand how we're impacting the environment. Where it gets a little bit murky and people get a little confused is that middle box, because we're still talking about sustainability related information, such as the climate and biodiversity, but we're not looking at so much how we impact the environment. We're looking at how those changes impact our organization. And it's really should be seen as kind of supplemental or additional information to that gray box of financial accounting. Because if we're saying that we have so much money in the bank and as business as usual will continue to grow by X% over 10 years, but we haven't considered that the majority of our assets might be in locations that are prone to natural disasters, and that's increasing from climate change, then our accounting actually doesn't make a bunch of sense because we haven't given the full picture and we haven't prepared for these changes that are coming. So just one more way to look at this to make sure it's clear. We have the financial statements, the sustainability related disclosures, and the sustainability report, which we just discussed. Those are the same boxes, but here's the information that each box will include. So first we have those financial statements that all accountants will be providing information on, and that's things like our assets, our liabilities, our equity, our income, our expenses, and our cash flow. We then also have our sustainability related financial disclosures. And in these, remember, that's informing or supporting our financial statements. So we might have a certain number of assets, and we've clearly stated in our financial statements what those assets are, but we provide then additional information in terms of how to interpret that value of those assets. If you're an accountant on this call, you're probably very used to having certain numbers that we use in order to understand how assets depreciate or appreciate over time. They can be worth less or more over time. But those numbers traditionally haven't looked at the sustainability impact. So assets can really be impacted by climate change, by biodiversity, also by shifts in consumer preferences. So this is adding a little bit more color to our financial statements and helping us understand those numbers within the real world, not just in our financial accounting world. And then if we look at the UN blue colored box there on the far side of your screen, we can see sustainability report. So here we're also talking about sustainability, but really we're going more into understanding how much our organization is impacting society and the environment as a whole. So here we want to understand the impact on the economy, on the environment, on people. We also want to understand if your organization is doing any philanthropy, whether it's because you've identified that there is some sort of impact that you want to lessen, or because that's important, for example, for your company to motivate its employees or to ensure that you're promoting certain areas. Keeping in mind that if that philanthropy you're doing actually has a significant impact on your income or your expenses, that will actually have to show up in your financial statements because it's considered to be financially material to your organization then. We also might have in the sustainability report additional explanations for specific stakeholder groups that you've considered to be particularly important. Now, just as an example that I think makes this very clear as to whether your sustainability information appears in that dark blue box or the light blue box, whether it appears with your financial statements or in a separate sustainability report, I like to look at planting trees. So this is a pretty common thing now. We use it, a lot of companies use it in order to mitigate emissions. So they might have a certain number of emissions that they're producing, and so they decide to plant trees. Now that can be used in two ways. You might be using it in order to achieve a net zero target, in order to reduce your company's emissions because you see there's a cost related to those emissions that you want to mitigate as an organization. In that case, it has a strategic objective and it will have a financial impact on your organization. So it should be included in that middle box, the sustainability related financial disclosures. However, you might plant trees because it's maybe a yearly project that you do with your employees in order to boost morale and to give them the opportunity to give back to the environment and show that you care to the environment. But it's not something that significantly impacts your finances, nor is used in your GHG emission accounting. It's simply just something additional that you do to offer your employees an opportunity. Then it should appear in your sustainability report. So just keeping in mind that these reports will have overlap, of course, but this is where we want to look for the information we're looking for. And I have a slight suspicion you're going to be looking for that middle box of information in the work that you're all doing. So that's kind of the overview of where information appears. But increasingly, it's not just up to the company to decide where they put this information. Actually, increasingly, it's required. Remember how before I was talking that one of the first things stock exchanges worked on was to create requirements or mandatory disclosure requirements? Well, that's happening more and more now. And that movement really started with the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So you can see here, this is actually, I think, a fairly old document, maybe a year old or so now. But you can see here that after the TCFD was launched in 2017, it didn't take very long for then governments to really push forth mandatory requirements. And we're expecting the same thing now to come from ISSB. And if you remember from a few slides earlier, the TCFD was in the lower boxes, and it's been now turned, kind of absorbed by the IFRS Foundation into their sustainability disclosure standards. I think you heard about them last week as well. Those are going to be very important as we look at how to achieve more disclosure from companies. And another important area of mandatory is we're seeing a lot more taxonomies. I just wanted to flag this, and I suggest you read it on your own time. But this isn't just for European companies. As we're moving into the mandatory sphere, Europe's really leading the way in this. But just keep in mind that a lot of these requirements are not only on companies that are listed in Europe, also they'll be applied to other companies in Europe and their supply chain. So if a company is supplying any sort of service or products into Europe, increasingly they're required to also report on their sustainability and particularly GHG emissions. But also it's on financing. So if you can see here, we also have the section that's talking about the SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. This is also really looking at the investors, where their money's going and what are they financing. How much of their portfolio, for example, a big asset manager, how much are they then investing in companies that are high emitters or really have a high impact on the environment or society? So this is something, this space is something that you should really be watching as it evolves and as it's required. Okay, so I think that gives a really high-level overview of where this information is. And if I can summarize it, it's really depending on where the company puts it, but increasingly it's mandated by companies to include this in their financial reports, which is not where we're used to finding sustainability information, but increasingly it's where it's being required to go, which is really important because if we're going to link these topics, GHG emissions, impact on biodiversity, societal impacts, if we're going to link that to the business case of a company and why its reason is to exist, we need to make that financial connection. We need to understand the risk that it poses. And that brings me to the what aspect here. So what is climate-related financial data? I know you had a pretty good cover with this with David last time, so let me just take a bit of a high-level perspective, and then if anything's missing, we can discuss it later. But let's go to the start of where this all came from. So climate and the environment have been a top global risk for businesses and governments for many years now. And if you're not familiar with this report from the World Economic Forum, it's a great report that really highlights these risks. But as you can see here, since 2019, environmental risks, so all those risks in green are environmental risks, have been the top 3 global risks since 2019 to this day as well. Now, one thing I will highlight about that is if we change the time horizon, that changes slightly. So as you can see, in the next 2 years, we have a bit more of a variation in where our risks are coming from. The top one is actually societal, a cost of living crisis, although I would argue that a lot of that does come from environmental causes. Then we also have some geopolitical risks there. We also see some cybersecurity and more societal at the bottom. It's more when we look into the longer term horizon that all our risks really land in environmental reasons. And that's where all of this need for disclosure came from. Many of you are probably familiar with this face, Mark Carney, who's now the UN Special Envoy on climate action and finance, but the former chair of the G20 Financial Stability Board, former governor of England. Here, he's talking to a group of insurers and insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London. And he said there, and this was, I believe in 2015, that the horizon for monetary policy extends out more or less 2 to 3 years. But for financial stability, we see maybe a little bit longer, but typically only to the outer boundaries of a credit cycle, which is about a decade. In other words, once climate change becomes a defining issue for financial stability, it's already too late. And what he was saying there is our vision of how far we look forward means that by the time we start acting on climate change, by the time we start integrating climate-related risks and opportunities into our financial analysis of companies and projects, it's too late. We, at that point, have crossed the tipping points. It's already too far. And we just have to deal with the risks then. We've invested in these companies, and if they fail and are not resilient and go under, then we lose that. And keep in mind here, he's talking to insurance underwriters. So who pays for these risks? Who has to put the money forth when assets are destroyed by climate change, when companies go out of business, when loans aren't repaid? This is looking really at the insurance company and then the financial system more broadly. So as David mentioned to you last week, there are certain risks that we started to be introduced to thanks to Mark Carney and his team's work, and then moving into the TCFD, which is now into the ISSB. And those risks are primarily transition risks and physical risks. So the transition risks that we're looking at are these 4 categories here. We have policy and legal risks, we have technology risks, we have market risks and reputational risks. And then we also have the physical risks of acute and chronic. Now, those transition risks, I think as David mentioned last time, are really the risks related to transitioning to a low carbon economy. And as you can see in that list there, it's a lot of change related risks. Changes that if we're not prepared for can impact the resilience of our organizations or our finance. The physical risks are the ones we're more familiar with, I think, with climate change. And those are either acute, meaning severe weather events such as hurricanes, rain, any sort of severe, one-time events that we're going to see more and more of those. Then we have chronic, where it's a slow increase over time. So that's the increasing of water levels around the world. That's the increasing of temperatures, the melting of the glaciers, etc. Now, these risks have been highlighted by the TCFD, not because they think they're brand new and nobody's thought of them before, but rather because companies haven't been considering how they impact them financially. So the key to reporting and disclosure now is really that financial impact. We want to understand how transition risk or physical risk impacts our company's revenue, cost flow, cash flow, impairment charges, etc. in the short, the medium, and the long term. So we're looking much further in the future than we have before to try to understand that long-term impact that Mark Carney was talking about, so that we can make the changes today that means we're ready for it and we won't have that negative impact in the future. But there's opportunities too, and I always really like to highlight the opportunities because although we talk a lot about risk, and I think we do that a lot to scare everybody into this movement, climate change is really scary, and you're all here for this reason. I know you don't need to be convinced that climate risk or climate change is real, but there's a ton of opportunities. And this report's really interesting. I would have it's a little bit old now. I mean, I don't know if 2019 is considered old, but it's been out for a little while now. And as you can see in this report, where they looked at kind of top companies by market capitalization, they had them discuss what their potential financial impacts are from the climate. And if you can see here, the red lines are all the opportunities and the gray lines are risks, and the opportunities way outmeasure the risks here. I'm just trying to see if I have the full numbers here, but I think the risks, yeah. So the risks were 970 billion total in risks that were identified, but the opportunities were 2.1 trillion. So significantly more opportunity here than risk. However, if you're not evaluating these risks and opportunities and how they impact your organization, it's virtually impossible to capitalize on those. So just a reminder of what these opportunities are. Some, but not all, it's up to a company to really evaluate their own opportunities and risks, are things like resource efficiency, energy source shifts, products and services, markets, and resilience. So this is all adapting to those transitions that we're seeing. And again, what we want to understand is how those impact your revenue, your cost, your cash flow, your portfolio, your liabilities, equity, etc. So what we want to know is, in business terms, that financial statement, that gray box of accounting, we want to know how all of this other information impacts that and will change it over the short, medium, and long term. So just to flag how the TCFD started to introduce that when it was brought in 2017. It started with these 4 core pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And this is the type of information we want to see from companies, and that companies are increasingly required to disclose. Now, the important things I think to take away from TCFD when it was developed is that it required that companies report climate-related financial disclosures in their annual financial filings. So you remember we had those reports that were considered sustainability reports, which are in alignment with GRI, but then we had that middle box that was supporting our financial statements. So that's what TCFD is for, is that middle box of that supporting information to our financial statements. It also provided additional guidance for certain sectors that were deemed to be high risk sectors, so those that emit a high amount, but also the financial sector. Because as you can imagine, a lot of this is quite difficult for financial sector companies, because they're having to look at not only their own emissions, but the emissions of every company they give loans to and every company they invest in, which does get incredibly complex. But it means that the financial sector now actually has to know more about where its money is going. So it actually has an impact on financial stability if it's done right. It also provided these risks and opportunities we were talking about, and kind of a taxonomy or classification of risks and opportunities, which makes it a bit easier for companies to disclose this and make sure they're disclosing similar risks and opportunities to everybody else. It also introduced much more forward-thinking reporting. We're used to really looking backwards in our accounting and looking at how we've done in the past, but we're not looking so much generally into the future. So this really shifts our focus into the future, into the short, the medium, and the long term. And to do that, it introduced a tool. It's not a new tool, but it made it more relevant in using a scenario analysis. I'm not sure if David talked to you about that last time. I'm sure you'll hear a lot about it, but it's really setting out certain futures we might see, such as we might reach 1.5 degrees, or we might reach 3 degrees. And as you all know, I'm sure those are very different futures, and that'll be very different worlds that we're living in. So how will a company survive one of those 2 pathways? And obviously, if we're going to 1.5, we're going to have to consider that the transition risks are going to be high. That means things are going to change very drastically. Regulation's going to come through. We're going to have requirements that will have high costs related to them. We'll be forced into new energy. Fossil fuels will be no more. So how will that impact our company and how our company survives through that transition? However, if we see the 3-degree pathway, totally different environment we'll be operating in, then we'll probably not have such a fast regulatory push. We might be able to use fossil fuels for much longer. However, we'll have really high physical risks then. So we'll have to deal with the impact on our assets, the impact on our supply chain. Transportation will be more difficult. How do we physically move products around the world? And who are our customers and where they're living, and do they need the products we have anymore? So looking at those different scenarios helps us understand what that financial impact will be and to prepare for it ahead of time. And then the last 2 is, I've mentioned many times, short, medium, and long term. We're really looking forward in the future now, and both qualitative and quantitative. As I just described in those scenario analysis scenarios, we can't always quantify everything, but we can start by describing it and trying to understand the impacts we'll see. And as we build up that expertise, we can apply more and more of a quantified perspective there. A few of you said you were looking for data and analysis and really kind of quantifying this information. I'll just make sure it's very clear here. Quantification is not always better. Sometimes we need to understand the story around it. We need to understand the strategy. We need to understand how things are governed, etc. So it's not always that we want numbers specifically. Those are certainly important, but we also need to go beyond numbers to understand how a company is prepared for this information or for this change. Okay, so the ISSB, like the TCFD, still has those 4 core pillars. As you can see here: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And so to give you an example of the qualitative information we'll receive, we want to understand, for example, on the governance body, do we have any climate educated or climate experienced board members? And we also want to understand who is dealing with climate change and how they're dealing with it and how they communicate with each other. And these are things that can't necessarily be quantified, but they're very important. They're in place. As we do our training on TCFD and ISSB with stock exchanges, we really try to highlight the importance of the processes behind the scenes, not just the end publication that comes out. Before you can create any sort of guidance to your stakeholders, any sort of communication through your reporting and your disclosure, you really need to look within the organization and understand how well you actually are equipped for this, and then truthfully report that. This is a problem between greenwashing and green hushing. We need to disclose certain information because without it, investors assume we're not prepared. But if we disclose too much, or if we're suggesting we're doing more than we are, then we have legal liability, so we might have to stand up again. So it's really about getting that balance between disclosing sufficient information so that investors understand how prepared you are for this, but not over-exaggerating it so that you actually are held to standards that you would never be able to achieve. Okay, so I think I'm over time, but I just have one more section, and it's really just one more slide. So now that we understand where we find this information, especially for public companies, but also for their associated supply chain, and the increasing requirement in regulation to be able to disclose this information, and we understand why we need this information and the importance of time horizons and understanding the narrative around this information, how do we really use this information? So I have 3 kind of core steps that I think are really important that you take into consideration as you're going forward using this information. These are actually very similar to the steps that we advise companies to go through. So we have one more for companies, but I condensed it a little bit for all of you. But the first one is prepare. And you're already doing that here today. And as a part of this program, I think we see a lot of people jump into this field without taking this first step of preparing. And we suggest that you prepare the landscape, the language, and the purpose. And if you skip this, I think you'll make a lot of mistakes later on. So when I say prepare the landscape, really understand what is the current status in the market. What are all the companies in that industry disclosing? What is kind of best practice? Which type of emissions are they looking at? What is the language being used? Because different countries and different companies will be using different language for the same thing. So making sure that you understand the breadth of language so you're not misinterpreting or missing certain data. And what is the purpose? So for example, if you're looking at a financial report and a TCFD, for example, aligned report, the purpose of that report is going to be very different from a GRI or a sustainability report. That's because they're for different audiences. So the TCFD report is really for investors. So what we really want to understand is the financial impact, where the GRI report is looking at broader stakeholder groups. We also often see climate reports where companies are really trying to show that the climate's really important to them, and they provide tons of data. And often you'll see these reports from oil and gas companies. So really think through what is the purpose behind the information that you want to look at. Also, you'll want to look at what is your purpose. What are you using this information for? Because if you're not thinking through what you need it for, you might be collecting incorrect information or information that's skewed for a different audience. Then what we do is we suggest for companies, we normally suggest them next a step, which we call align, where we want them to align to global local, and peer standards. So we want companies to look at what is it that is required for them at a global level, which is usually the ISSB now. What are their local regulation or requirements? And then what are their peer groups doing to make sure that there's alignment with that? However, if you're evaluating data, you can skip that step and go right to integrate. And in integrate, we have 3 kind of key steps as well too, which is to identify the appropriate risks and opportunities, to evaluate how that's being managed, and then to make your assessment based on proof, not promises. So as you find this information, integrate it for yourselves into the questions you're asking and understand really what is meant by all those data points. I think a lot of, especially researchers and people who are used to using data, and I come from the PhD world, so I'm in there with you. We want to find numbers and patterns, and we want them to say certain things. But climate-related data needs a story attached to it. We need to understand a lot more than just the numbers. And then finally, communicate. So then you can take it and share your report. And we really advise companies to communicate only once the first 2 steps, or for them 3 steps, have been defined. For companies, what we obviously advise them to do is to communicate in the appropriate location, in the appropriate timing, with appropriate authorities, which is all things you figure out in the previous steps. But for the rest of you, I think what you really want to do when you're communicating it is really keep clear that you're staying true to what you started at with the question. What was the data you needed for that question? How are you using that data to appropriately assess the risk management and the opportunity management of those climate-related risks and opportunities? And then what is the purpose of communicating that information? Who are you trying to reach with this, and what impact are you trying to make? Someone said, is there somewhere where these 3 steps are defined? And no, we have it in our own training. So feel free to join our training at any time, and we'll continue that. Just so you all know, we do train directly with stock exchanges, but sometimes we hold global training open to everyone. So feel free to follow us on LinkedIn. You can look up the SSE initiative or join our mailing list, which in a moment I can also share with the group. And then you'll know if we're doing certain trainings. You can also check out our YouTube channel, where we do have previous trainings on our YouTube channel, which are currently TCFD, not ISSB, because we're just transitioning to ISSB. And with that, probably too long of a presentation, I'll pause and see if there's any questions I can answer.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. This was very, very insightful. At the end, in the end of your presentation, I personally learned how to report using the 3-step approach to prepare, integrate, and then finally communicate the information that you want to share. So please, if you have any question, you can drop it in the chat box and we will read it out to Tiffany. And if you would like to unmute your microphone, you'd like to speak directly, you can raise your hand and you unmute yourself and go ahead with your question as well. So if you have any, I saw some few questions. I don't know. Feel free to ask your question. I mean, we have.
I see Bruna, I think you were first. Did you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tiffany, for this insightful presentation. I hope you can hear me well.
I hear you well, yeah.
Okay, that's great then. So I actually have 2 questions. So the first one would be, what does it imply for a stock exchange to become a SEC partner? So is there any kind of commitments or targets that are aligned to this partnership? And the second one is, what do you see as an advantage for a stock exchange to become an SEC partners? Because I think working with sustainable finance and climate finance, I think the most challenging thing is actually to prove to mainstream finance that considering sustainability issues is important. So those are my 2 questions, and thank you again for the presentation.
No problem. Thanks, Bruna. Should I answer one by one, or do you want me to collect a few?
Anyhow you would want to
Okay.
you know,
I'll just answer them
maybe.
one by one then to make sure I don't miss any. Thanks, Bruna.
All
So
right.
the requirements, those are, yes, we do have some requirements. First, we require the CEO or the board chair of a stock exchange to sign a commitment letter to us. And that's actually on our website too. So it's all very transparent. You can see we have a list of fact sheets of all the stock exchanges, and in the main stock exchanges in the world. We collect facts, which is how we get those trend databases from. And if they're a partner exchange, their commitment letter is also on that fact sheet. We've also changed our membership recently. Basically, because of questions like that, we realized we needed a bit more accountability. When we started, stock exchanges were only, a little interested. They were not sure what was happening here. They were maybe a little bit interested, and we were more enticing them to come to us. Now all exchanges are interested and they all want in on this. So we don't have to entice them anymore. So we're pushing them a little bit more. So what we require in their first year is they have to have one catch-up call with us so that we can see what they're doing and give them advice to move forward. And we require them to do one of the items on the fact sheet. So those things that I was showing on the trend line, they have to do at least one of those. In their second year, then they have to do two, still just one call with us. And we've also increased our types of membership. So we have supporters now. So these are stock exchanges that wanted to show a financial commitment to sustainability as well. And so they provide a small voluntary fund to the SSE, which is used specifically for training and education purposes. And what do they get from it? I like to think a lot. We try to make sure we're here for them. So each stock exchange kind of considers the SSE as their personal sustainability advisory team. So they can call us anytime and we support them through the process. The reason we know what to tell them is because we talk to all the other stock exchanges and we do a lot of groups. So whenever we do a guidance document, for example, we pull a bunch of experts together. We get a bunch of our partners involved and we allow them in that process of developing guidance and education. And then we've increased our offerings to them over time. But I think based on our great relationship with them, they get quite a bit from being a part of the initiative. Thanks, Bruna. I saw Stephen, you had your hand up next. And is that a real background behind you? It looks like a pretty nice location you're in.
Yeah, so hi, Tiffany. Thank you so much. I'm from Jamaica originally, but I am now in Spain, visiting an eco-village here and working on a farm. So these are some Spanish bricks that you can see in the building, not a tropical island that I'm from. And yes, Jamaica is part of the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, and part of my master's thesis was researching a bit and reading your report. So very interesting stuff. Really encourage the other people on the call to check out what you're publishing. But I'm very curious to hear more about, and it's sort of related to the questions that Bruna had, of what are you doing to engage with the stock exchanges that are not yet part of the initiative? And then also, how do you engage with the bigger stock exchanges
in Europe, where enough work isn't being done? And how can we, as participants of this call, help motivate our countries to do more?
That's a great question. So I think it definitely varies how we interact with each exchange, not necessarily based on their size, I wouldn't say. It would depend on people. It's really, and I think as many of you will learn in your careers in sustainability, is it really all comes down to people. We're all human beings, and some of us are easier to work with and some of us are less easy to work with. Some of us really highlight in our work the importance of sustainability and we really live it, and some of us don't. And we found the same with stock exchanges. An example I often share is with NASDAQ, which has been a member of the SSE since it was founded in 2009. We've asked the vice chair a few times there, why were you an early joiner? Why are you interested in this? And he time and time again says, because I have grandchildren and I want them to have a planet to live on. Now, that's not a business case. That's purely a human case. And we find that a lot of our most active exchanges have one or two champions within the exchange that really prioritize this. Now, how do you create champions is the question, I think. And that's something that I was looking into in my PhD thesis as well. And I think it's something all of you can definitely learn from. And education is key. If stock exchanges are comfortable with a topic, particularly at the high level, right? a lower level staff member can be mandated to do research and learn something. As long as they're given the mandate and the resources to do that, they'll do it. At the higher level, where we want someone to actually give those resources and give that mandate to somebody, the only way we get them to move on this is A, curiosity, and B, a lack of fear. I think if people are afraid of something, it's usually because they don't understand it. They're not going to move forward on it. So what we do at the SSE is we work really hard to never give a blank piece of paper. We always give a stock exchange. You've seen our model guidance documents, I'm sure. We give them a template, something very easy to use. It can be copy and pasted so that they don't look like they don't understand a topic sufficiently. But we also do it to help educate them because they have to read it. They have to process it. They have to determine how it fits their market. And as these executives, really, the board level and the C-suite, as they learn more about this topic, they want more involved and they want to make sure that their exchange is leading, and then they kind of take the charge from there. So I think if I were to give any advice to all of you, it's the importance of educating everyone around you. Talk about it. Share it in a way that's not talking down to them or suggesting you know more than them, but being willing to answer their questions and their curiosities and share what's happening and how it might be interesting or related to them and those opportunities, how they can basically capitalize or make money off of climate change and the shifts in the world, because it's really the business speak that I think often starts it. But then as people become comfortable with it, they, I guess, as we call it, you know, drink the Kool-Aid, and they realize that it's really important and they keep working on it. Thanks for the question, Stephen. Isabel, I think you were next.
Yes. Hi,
Yes,
Tiffany.
ma'am.
Can you hear me well?
I hear you well.
Great. So my name is Isabella. I'm from Brazil, and I'm currently working in green growth and climate financing for sustainable transportation. But I also do research on landscape restoration.
Okay.
And my question is more on that side because I am curious about how flexible and adaptable are the metrics and targets that ISSB reviews and evaluates, and how you evaluate qualitative indicators, because that is something that we have been struggling with in our sustainable transportation projects in the organization I work with, and especially how to measure socioeconomic impacts, not only on the mitigation side, but understanding how the projects that we work with, they affect the people that are part of the projects. And my question about how adaptable and flexible the targets are is more because of my research. As an example, I am doing research on restoration projects in the Brazilian savanna, and through policy research, we found out that many of the restoration strategies that they use are not adapted to the biomes that they're working with, so that causes more harm than goods. But when we look at the financing reports and the sustainability reporting, we see that in the reporting itself, it looks fine. But when we look at the realities, there are some issues to that. So I wanted to know more on these areas.
Sure. So I think that's a great question. I think it's something that everybody's dealing with right now is how do we not spend 5 hours reading a report to be able to get the most out of it and to use this information? And so I think there's a few answers to that I think we're on the right pathway for. The first is the ISSB, it basically, rather than being a checklist, what it does is it sets like a standard of certain things that we want to see in disclosure in order to be able to say, make our assessment. Without this information, essentially, we don't have a clear enough picture. So that doesn't make it easier to assess, because it means, for example, if we look at the governance side of it, what we really want to understand is we want to understand how climate change or sustainability issues are governed at the board level, but then also in the management, in the C-suite. So we want to understand how the leaders of the company are responsible for this. And there's certain things that are quantified there. For example, we can understand how a remuneration policy is put in place in order to connect our GHG emissions, for example, and our improvement in GHG emissions, or our direction towards net zero, or our impact on biodiversity. We can connect those numbers to our remuneration, and that is quantifiable. However, having, for example, a board member that's done a certain amount of certifications, or has been educated, or has experience in GHG accounting, for example, that's something that's quantifiable. It's a tick box, essentially, like, does this exist and can we see it? So I think where we're going to see two advancements. One is because it's standardized in the ISSB, which is similar to TCFD. And I just to connect it to a question in the chat box, someone said TCFD is not being transferred to ISSB. So where will that stand? TCFD is actually transferred. It's absorbed by ISSB. So it's just, now we had TCFD, now we expanded into ISSB, but it's really the same framework. It's just a few alterations that have been made to it. So TCFD 2.0 perhaps. So if we look at this, standardized process, these are like the core things we want to see in a report. It makes it easier for AI. So now we can use new technologies to be able to look at these reports and identify if they've provided this information in an appropriate way. Also, both TCFD and ISSB have really heavily lent on two kind of forward-looking aspects. One is a scenario analysis, which I discussed, which is where we can quantify, because if we are putting out these, clear scenarios we're working towards, we can have clear numbers in there, and we can say, in a 3-degree world, or a 1.5-degree world, or a 2-degree world, this is how our assets will depreciate or appreciate. This is how the consumer shifts will impact our revenue. This is how the energy costs will change in our organization. And there's a number of agencies that work to create that data that's often publicly available. So we can calculate that now with a scenario analysis. Not that we know which future is coming, but at least we know in different futures what the impact will be. But then we also have the transition plan. Now, we are kind of used to, in businesses, not sharing too much of our strategy. That's kind of our, our secret sauce that we don't want everybody to know. But because we're standardizing how we're using a transition plan now and what's required in disclosure of transition plan, we're kind of forcing companies to share a bit of what they're planning in the future and how they're going to get to particularly net zero targets, understanding how we're going to reduce our emissions. And again, that forces us to think future oriented, and it forces us to do more calculations to understand how our emissions are going to change and how we're going to replace things in our supply chain and how we're going to impact the environment in the process. So I do think that that's forcing at least the private sector and corporations to kind of amplify the way they look at things and look more in the future, and hopefully spot those risks that they had identified that you mentioned, of not really looking at the appropriate environment and not really considering where they're located when they're making these plans. It's not perfect. I think we're moving in the right direction, though.
No, they are definitely very interesting, and I will keep up with ISEB in the future. Thank you.
Great, nice to meet you. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
I think, but before Margarita comes in with the question, and I think Shay was asking the question. I mean, you touched on it, but not fully. He also wanted to know if there will be any particular platform in the near future where there's going to be space for reporting.
Sure, yeah. I wonder if Jay was talking about the TCFD Knowledge Hub, which we used to have with TCFD, which still exists, and I highly recommend it. But the good news is actually, so we work very closely with ISSB, and they are working on an ISSB Knowledge Hub. So this is where companies should be able to share their own reports if they're in alignment with ISSB. For now, I suggest looking at the TCFD Knowledge Hub. If you just Google TCFD Knowledge Hub, you can look for reports by sector or by country or type of company, and you can look for their reports there. Of course, always reports, if they're a listed company, they're always public. So you can find it via the stock exchange platform, or just go to the company's website. And if you go to their investor relations tab or anything related to investors, you'll be able to find their annual reports on their own websites as well.
All right, thank you very much. Last one. I'm still sharing the attendance form, so you can tap on it to fill in. And I think we have one last question. That is from Margarita.
I think.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for the presentation, Tiffany. You mentioned that right now at the moment you are meeting with the entities like once a year and requiring from them like to tick one of the boxes that you've showed us before, right? So my question is, as time passes and the situation aggravates, do you have any plans to increase the demands or requirements that you're expecting from the entities? And so if this level and rhythm that you're having at the moment, do you think it's of engagement, right? If you think that is enough in the long term and sustainable?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Although I do echo Alona that your background is beautiful. I wish I was where you were. Yeah, I think we continue to push them in various ways. So before we had these accountability mechanisms, we used to push them in a very different way, which we still do. But as time shifts, we have to do a little bit of dancing ourselves in how we do that. So when we first started as the SSE, we first had just stock exchanges at the table. So we'd have, a few CEOs, maybe their board chairs, and we'd, present an agenda and we'd say, here's how you need to move forward. And we found a lot of excuses. They'd say, our regulatory authority doesn't want this, the companies don't want it, they'll delist, and then we lose our clients, or the investors don't even know how to use this information. Why should we be doing it? And so we learned pretty quickly, we can't have a meeting without everybody at the table. So we then started inviting the regulators, the investors, the companies, the policymakers, and we said, okay, you can't blame any of these people now unless you have a legitimate excuse, and then we can make them move forward on it. And that provided a lot of peer pressure. So we get all these people together now at the high level, really to encourage them to want to share their best practice. And we found that worked really well. So now we highlight that a lot. We try to highlight our exchanges that are doing something really great, and we bring them to the forefront. We say, look what the Jamaica Stock Exchange is doing, or look what the Panama Stock Exchange is doing. And then we say, what are you all doing? Why aren't you doing this? If you're having trouble, we'll walk you through it, and we'll bring in the Panama Exchange, we'll bring in the Jamaica Stock Exchange, and they'll help you through it too. Now I think we're nearly at the next phase because actually all exchanges are doing really great things. So, we have a ton of exchanges that we can highlight now, and we probably don't have the time at any meeting to be able to highlight all of them. But rather where we're working on more now is with the regulatory authorities. As you can maybe remember from that chart, that was the lowest thing on the line. It started off as the fastest growing, and then it kind of leveled out. And that's because, as many of you know, government negotiations and regulatory movements take time, and they can shift as the government shifts. When we get a new person or party leader come in, we can get total shifts too. So we try to use the stock exchange as that continuity in the country that keeps this moving forward. And then we have them either, if they're able to, put pressure on the regulatory authority, or we let them use us as a scapegoat, and we talk to the regulatory authority on their behalf if they're not allowed to do that upward pressure to the regulatory authority. And then we share with their regulatory authority what other organizations are doing. And so now we're working a lot more with IOSCO, which is the International Organization for Securities Regulation. And I think that push and that collaboration that we're doing will push stock exchanges a little bit more as well. You're welcome. Enjoy your time on the beach or wherever you are.
Thank you very much. I think Jeremy wants to ask a question. So Jeremy, if you're available, you can unmute. Jeremy, if not, you can also type it in the chat.
I see, is it Jeremy Guao in the Solomon Islands? I see a question in the chat, which says, how can you engage with us in the Pacific Islands? Well, I'd love to come visit, first of all. It's a serious question. So we at the SSE engage via stock exchanges. So we always work with a local stock exchange in order to help them support their market. That said, as we've progressed as an initiative and built the SSE Academy, we now are open to helping kind of all capital market participants. So I'd say the first order of engagement would really be engaging with our knowledge activities. And I know you're probably thirsty for knowledge if you're here in this event. So highly recommend going to our website. You can look at the SSE Academy. So it's just sseinitiative.org/academy. And you can look at what training we're already offering and join our mailing list. And then you'll be informed of any additional training and any events that we're holding that may be accessible to you.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, we are all going to the website to look at how we could be part of the academy and also attend some of your events. I think all too soon we are wrapping up. It has been a very, very great presentation. I have really learned a lot, and we are definitely going to look at the materials that you proposed, and we would, share on our platforms to read further on it. So thank you very much. This is time for our closing remarks. Yes, this has been our second edition, and we have looked at how to analyze climate finance data and report on them. So hopefully the next session is going to take us to the next level. So thank you very much, everyone. I don't know if we can take a picture. Can we take a group picture, everyone? You can turn on your video for like some 5 seconds, and yeah, Karishma is going to help us. Are you there, Karishma? Can you
Actually,
take
I'm
the
joining on my phone. If someone can
uh
help us with the screenshots on PC, that would be great. I see
yeah
Cirilo is very much ready. Can anyone
yeah
volunteer for the group
any
photo from the
volunteer?
PC? Thanks,
If you have a
Stephen.
PC, you can.
I'll be
Yeah,
happy to volunteer.
great,
So
great.
Thank you.
I'm gonna take 3 shots because we have 3 pages of participants, which is great. So
Yeah.
everyone smile for the first one. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay. I'm gonna do the second page. Wow, so many faces. Great to see you all. Ready? And one more. Amazing. Thank you all.
Right. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And we will continue our conversations on the page. So for now, it is bye, 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 everyone. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Mariam.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much. Thank you. Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate
Do
it.
enjoy
you.
the rest of your
Bye-bye.
day. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Hello.